Okay, we will open this meeting today. So I'm Fran Inman, Chair of the California Transportation Commission, and we in California are delighted to be hosting our colleagues from the state of Washington and Oregon, and it's something that we look forward to listening and learning from each other. And so it's great to be here, and thanks to our host, MTC, for sharing your gorgeous almost sunshiny facility today. So note to file, anybody who hasn't been to a meeting in August in San Francisco, remember our Southern California duds don't work real well here when it comes to August attire, but here we are. So we've had a field trip this morning. We've been out to the Go Momentum test site, and I think we'll talk a little more about that later. But first and foremost, I want to thank the staffs from all of our commissions, because we get to just show up and participate, and it wouldn't be without the hard work and the advanced planning that goes in. So hats off, and join me in thanking all of our staff. So here we go. Okay, so it's going to be like speed dating, and Commissioner Kehoe, we're going to start with you, and let's do self-introductions and tell everybody just a real quick thing or two.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Am I on now? I'm Christine Kehoe from San Diego. It's my third year on the Transportation Commission, and prior to that, I worked with an electric vehicle group in California for about 5 years, and prior to that, I was in the legislature. Does that work?
You'll always be Senator Kehoe to us.
Is it on?
No, there it's on.
Yeah, I'm Shiv Batra. I'm from Seattle, Washington Transportation Commission. I've been on the commission about 3 years now, and prior to that, I was the CEO of a consulting firm, engineering transportation consulting firm. Thank you.
I'm Paul Van Kanatenberg. I have a farming company in Modesto, California. I've been on the commission for a year.
I'm Joe Tortorelli with the Washington Commission, and I've been on the commission for 7 years from Spokane.
I'm Jim Gilmuddy. Welcome to my hometown, San Francisco. I'm a home builder in Northern California, and I've been on the commission for, I hate to tell you, 15 years.
Good afternoon. I'm Martin Callery. I've been on the commission 3 whole months. I'm retired from marine and rail industries.
Hi, everyone. Lucy Dunn. On my day job, I'm president and CEO of the Orange County Business Council, where our issues are infrastructure, housing, education, innovation. Been on the commission, I can't remember, maybe like 12 years, something like that. Anyway, it's my third term, and delighted to welcome you all to beautiful California and Jim's hometown.
I'm Roy Jennings from Southwest Washington, Washington State Commission. I've been on the commission for a little bit over 4 years, and I come from transportation.
I'm Rima Griffith. I'm the Executive Director for the Washington Transportation Commission, and I've been in this role since 2005.
I'm Susan Branson, the Executive Director for the California Transportation Commission. I have served as the Executive Director since 2016. Prior to that, I served as the Chief Deputy Director.
Jerry Litt, Chair of the Washington Transportation Commission. I've been on commission for 7 years. I'm a retired planner, 42 years, and that was 30 in the public sector and 12 in the private sector.
Okay, so I'm Fran Inman, Majestic Realty, Commercial Real Estate's my day job. I've been on the commission since 2010, and my big news of the day is I got to drive that big Peterbilt big rig, so every day is a freight day.
And she made it look easy. My name is Tammy Bainey. I'm the chair of the Oregon Transportation Commission. I've been on the commission for 7 years, and during the day, I am a Deschutes County Commissioner. I live in Bend, Oregon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Averbeck. I'm the interim Oregon Transportation Commission manager. I've been in that role. It's a new position for a little over a year now. I've been with the Oregon Department of Transportation for about 13 years.
I am Jim Arp, Vice Chair of the California Transportation Commission. I've been on the commission for 12 years. This is my third term. And the last 2 years, I've been the assistant gardener for my wife and playmate for 12 grandchildren. But before that, I ran the California Alliance for Jobs.
Hi, I'm Hester Sarabrin. I'm from Seattle, and I'm with the Washington State Transportation Commission. And in my day job, I work at a nonprofit that works on sustainable transportation options.
I'm Bob Alvarado, California Transportation Commission. Been on the commission for about 13 years. During the day, I work for a small mom and pop nonprofit as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. Orlando Simpson, Oregon Transportation Commission. I've been on the commission for 4 years, and during the day, I am a small business owner, solid waste and recycling, and I represent the Portland metropolitan region of our state.
Good afternoon, everybody. Jim Madaffer, California Transportation Commission, coming up on 5 years. CEO of Madaffer Enterprises, where we do a little bit of land development, public affairs, and lobbying.
Debbie Young, Washington Transportation Commissioner from San Juan County. I've been on the commission about 3 years. I'm retired from the utility industry, and we currently operate a small diversified farm in San Juan County.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Van Brocklin. I'm on the Oregon Transportation Commission. I've been on it for 9 months. And I'm from Portland. I'm a lawyer with the firm of Stoll Reeves. I was in our office working this morning. Sorry I missed the tour. Delighted to be here.
Hi, Carl Guardino with the California Transportation Commission. Served now, this is our 12th year. Jim Harp and I came on the same day. And during the day, I work with technology companies on policy issues.
Okay, well, I say let's go to work. So moving right along, we're going to have a review of key transportation issues, what's keeping all of us up at night. So with that, we're going to start with Paul Parker from Washington State.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you a little bit about some of our hot topics in Washington. Okay. How do I advance this? It's not going. We can't depend too much on technology. Thank you. So just to give you a little perspective, the Washington Commission, 6 of our 7 members are here with you. By statute, 3 are required to come from east of the Cascade Mountains, and the other 4 obviously from west of the Cascades. The Secretary of the Department of Transportation and a representative from the Governor's Office are also non-voting members of our commission. Our roles and responsibilities to propose policy and finance recommendations to our governor and legislature. We are the tolling authority in Washington State, which means both tolls for highways and bridges, as well as we set the fares for Washington State ferries. We also have the responsibility to develop and update every 4 years a long-range statewide transportation plan. It gets interesting because our DOT also has a directive to do a long-range statewide transportation plan. We also conduct a lot of outreach to get public input into state transportation policy and promote education about transportation and to understand what's happening locally across the state. And we're a public forum for transportation policy development. Can you advance that? So when we look at our transportation system in Washington, the commission looks at everything from city streets, county roads, the highways, the rail, the air, as well as everything that moves on it. Advance it. So the good news, and one of our biggest hot topics, is that our state economy is booming. This chart shows you a little bit of what the employment growth has been in the state. The Puget Sound region is in green on these charts, and then the rest of the state is in the orange. So you can see that the Puget Sound area, not too surprisingly, is getting the bulk of that growth. However, our pictures show you wheat being loaded onto a freighter, as well as all of the cranes in the downtown Seattle area, thanks to the tech industry. Next slide. Next. Thanks. And I'm going to be focusing, I guess, on the bad news that relates to some of that good news in the next 4 slides. We've got increasing debt burden, inadequate investment in preservation, and that's across the state. The traffic is overwhelming, particularly in the main Puget Sound area, and the growth is uneven. Not everywhere in the state is growing. Next slide. So I mentioned that our debt is growing. Our state did not do a great job of investing in the transportation system back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when the state was also growing a lot. Our legislature passed our Growth Management Act in the spring of 1990 after a lot of that growth happened. The population was booming, the industry was growing quite a bit, but the highway system and the public transportation system didn't grow to match it. And so starting in the 2000s with 2003, 2005, and then again in 2015, our legislature increased the gas tax, and with the 2003 and 2005 packages, every penny of that was bonded against. With the 2015 package, a significant part of it was bonded against. So at the state level now, we have a lot of transportation debt. At the local level, I did mention that there was not a lot of investment in mass transit in the central Puget Sound Basin. So now, finally, after a couple of failed measures to get light rail and commuter rail in the Puget Sound area, we have it happening. I think that those of you who were up in Seattle visiting with us a few years ago got to experience the first part of our light rail system from the airport to downtown. It now reaches out to the University of Washington. In a couple of years, it'll be heading farther north, farther south, and across Lake Washington to Bellevue. But it's coming at a high price locally. Property taxes have increased, vehicle licensing fees have increased, and sales taxes have increased. And despite the need for that mass transit system, some people in that Puget Sound area are yelling, wait a minute, it's too much for us. So we have growing debt, we have growing congestion, and inadequate revenue to keep pace with everything that does need to be done on both the highway and the transit side. Next slide. In addition to that, we're not spending enough on preservation, and that's across all of the sectors, whether it's the state, counties, cities, and probably transit agencies would say that as well. So in our Connecting Washington package that was passed by our legislature in 2015, it's a $16 billion spending package over 15, 16 years. And you see that green slice there is the amount of that that's being spent on highway preservation, about 9%. The purple slice, which is 52%, is the money that's being spent on highway improvements and expansion. So it's an imbalance as far as the state transportation is concerned, and it's one that we continue to point out to our legislature and our executive branch. I mentioned that traffic is overwhelming in the central Puget Sound. Our travel times have increased on all corridors. At the same time, transit boardings in the King, Pierce, and Snohomish region are up 17%, and many routes are overcrowded, and this is contrary to all national trends. So transit use is going up, the transit system is growing, the freeway system is also overloaded, as are many of the surface streets. It's very frustrating for people. And yet, I said not everywhere is growing. There are significant parts of the state where growth is happening at a very slow pace, maybe 1 or 2% or less per year. The growth is also happening besides in the Puget Sound area. It's happening in Clark County, which is right across the river from Columbia River from Portland, and the Portland metro area. And the other part of the state that's growing very quickly is the area around what we call the Tri-Cities of Washington, which is the cities of Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, and the home of the Hanford Reservation. That area is growing because of the nuclear waste cleanup, but also there's a lot of agriculture in the surrounding area, and that area is continuing to grow pretty rapidly. On the downside, because of all that investment in transportation, especially in the central Puget Sound, but that connecting Washington package throughout the state, construction costs are up everywhere. Sound Transit is investing $32 billion on the transit improvements in central Puget Sound over about a 20-year period. The state's got that $16 billion investment project. So that is trickling down into impacts all over the state. And so even though the growth isn't happening everywhere, the construction cost impacts are happening everywhere. Social equity is also becoming a statewide concern because housing costs are growing much more quickly than wages are just about everywhere in the state, and we still have high poverty in many parts of the state, especially in rural areas. On the positive side, I think we have a very good planning process in Washington State, and as I said, one of the jobs of the Commission is to update the statewide long-range transportation plan. There's a picture of it there in the lower right of the slide, and this is what it looks like on paper right now. We have our draft plan out for public review and comment until September 20th, and then we will be adopting the final update for Transportation 2040 and beyond in December. One of the big changes we're making is what we adopt in December is going to be primarily an online web-based plan, and it will have links to all of the state modal plans and all of the regional plans from the 14 different regions across the state. The three areas that we're focusing on for this update are resiliency, whether due to climate change and natural disasters, whether they be seismic or wildfires or floods. We're looking at technology and how that's going to affect transportation in the future, both from the policy side and the funding side. And then, of course, we're looking at funding sustainability over the long run. So with PEC, and we'll be talking about this a lot more the rest of this meeting, since we don't know how technology is going to change and shape transportation over the next 20 years, we are spending more time asking questions than making predictions in this long-range plan, and asking, will it result in more sprawl and longer commutes, or less sprawl and shorter commutes? Will we need parking as much as we do today, or will managing curb space be the priority? Will we need to do congestion pricing, or will we have surplus space on the roadways? Will mobility as a service prevail, and what will be the impacts on that for public transportation? Just as some of the questions that we're trying to ask. Transportation also, as it relates to resiliency, it's critical for emergency response, societal recovery, and business continuity. And there, again, what we're urging the regions and localities as well as the state to do is to look at how transportation is part of the whole web of recovery and for planning for natural disasters. Finally, sustainable funding. We are finding in Washington that tolling is becoming more and more of an important part of financing our state transportation system, as well as other types of user fees. Tolling generated over $193 million for the state in 2017. We just standardized the exemptions across our 3, soon to be 4 operating toll facilities. We're opening a new toll facility, we think sometime this fall, which will be the tunnel under Seattle that replaces the Alaska Way viaduct. That depends on the final testing that project is going through right now. There are 2 other projects that tolling is anticipated for based on that 2016 transportation package, completing a couple of links to I-5 and our ports, and also an extension of the express toll lanes from Bellevue on the east side of Lake Washington all the way to the south side of the lake. Ferry fares raise nearly $400 million in a biennium period. They cover about 75% of the operating costs of Washington State ferries. And then in our road usage charge pilot that you'll hear more about, we've got 2,000 volunteers currently, and we'll be making our report and recommendations to the legislature on that in January of 2020. Finally, we do, as I said, a lot of public education and outreach. We meet 4 or 5 times a year in different areas of the state, and I put this map together to illustrate to all of you from Oregon and California just where the commission has met since we last met together 2 years ago in Portland. So the stars represent the different parts of the state that we've met in since that meeting. We try to get around to the different areas, and I did leave at your seat, each of you, a copy of the commission's annual report. We spend a full page of this report each year reporting to the legislature and our governor just what we heard when we did these different visits around each part of the state. And we spend that time one whole day hearing from folks locally at the county, city, the public transportation, Chamber of Commerce, ag community, other people who use the transportation system, how it's working for them. Again, from the city streets all the way up to the air service in that locality. And then we spend a half a day prior to that meeting typically getting out and touring in that area to see the transportation facilities. So this is valuable information that helps us as we do our long-range planning, and we hope that it's also helpful to the legislators from different parts of the state to get an understanding of what's happening in other areas of the state. That concludes my very brief presentation about some of the hot topics that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Jerry. I think we'll do all 3 of our presentations and then ask our panelists. We can hold our questions when we've heard all 3 of the presentations. So next, moving down the West Coast to the state of Oregon, Tammy.
Okay, I think I can get this going. Wonderful. Okay, so the last time that we met, and I wanted to say thank you for hosting us. It's wonderful to be here. I did know to bring a sweater, though. We were passing the hat, and since the last time that we have met, Oregon has passed legislation, and so we have some funding. So we thought we would go over how we are investing those funds. And so first, let's start with a little bit about Oregon. So Oregon has a population of 4.1 million people. We have about 1.9 million vehicle registrations. We have over 74,000 miles of roadway, and of those, 39,000 are paved. Only 8,000, though, are state-owned, and so that partnership between cities and counties is really critical. 87% of our system is fair or better. We have 6,800 bridges, over 2,300 miles of freight railroad, and 8 commercial airports. So that's Oregon in a nutshell. So moving on to the priority areas in Oregon, the Governor Kitzhaber, and then carried on by Governor Brown, convened a visioning panel to go around the state of Oregon and hear from communities from all over, small communities, the Portland metropolitan area, listening to hear what the concerns are and what the challenges are in each of the regions. And that was carried on by the legislature's Joint Committee on Transportation and Modernization. And we heard some themes that were clear. It didn't matter if we were in a community of 1,500 people or 150,000 people. We heard that the first priority in Oregon was to preserve and maintain the system and protect the asset that we have today. The next thing that we heard was that the congestion issues that are happening in the Portland region were causing an issue in terms of economic vitality all across the state. So it didn't matter if it was Eastern Oregon or if we're trying to get goods through the Portland metropolitan area, congestion was clearly an issue. Next, we moved on to public transportation, and I think that was maybe a little bit surprising in hearing from some very rural areas of our state talking about access to healthcare, access to education. So that was definitely something that rose to the top as well. So in 2017, the legislature went to work and took a courageous vote, and that was rolled into House Bill 2017. Within that provided the comprehensive strategy to have those lasting improvements to keep Oregon moving. So in total, it will end up in about $600 million across all modes in Oregon for investment, and we'll go through some of those next. So highway investments. This is a snapshot here of the comparison of our funding and the implementation. At full implementation, the gas tax, vehicle fee, and truck tax increases will raise about $500 million. That's nearly twice as large as the Jobs and Transportation Act and 5 times as much as our OTIA 3 bridge program that some of you may be familiar with. This is the infamous Oregon chart of our funding. Looks more like a heartbeat. It's not always easy, as we all know in transportation, these ebbs and flows. But clearly you can see that as a result, our construction programs will grow significantly, and I think this poses a challenge for each of us. I know that Paul talked about increase the estimates and costs to actually deliver projects is on the rise, but finding the skilled workforce and those to be able to deliver the projects as well is certainly an increasing issue in Oregon. Next, an opportunity to see where the highway projects are, so you can see what's happening, sandwiched between the two wonderful states of California and Washington. We have a lot of investments. It's about $1 billion that will go to state and local road projects spread across our entire state. And with this additional safety improvements along Highway 97, you will see, which is a priority. It was mentioned as in terms of the Cascadia, that resilience for not only our economic vitality, but also making sure from a life safety perspective of being able to get our state back online, and so that is a high priority. Moving on now to reducing congestion, and while we do know that tolling is not something that is new, it's something that we are talking about doing in the state of Oregon. So all across the state, the Visioning Panel and the Joint Committee on Transportation Modernization heard clearly that the impacts of gridlock and costs in terms of doing business in the Portland area was creating an issue. We are an export-driven economy in the state of Oregon. About $20 billion in goods is exported annually, so it is critical for us to be moving goods through that part of our state. So next, going on to the allocation of the ODOT Highway Fund of House Bill 2017, you can see where some of our investment, where the funding goes. Most of our funding will go to the road maintenance and preservation for fixing our roads. And I think that that holds true to that priority as a state, making sure that we protect that asset. The roads and bridges in our state, we didn't just have enough to repair and replace those, but without the opportunity to have that increased investment, we wouldn't be able to meet the needs that we have ongoing. So this is a snapshot of our state highway conditions that we were anticipating on the left-hand side if we were not able to move forward with the funding package. And we had anticipated by 2030 that a third of our system would be in poor condition. We're proud to say that with House Bill 2017 that will be reduced to around 20%, while also not great, clearly better than a third. And then moving on to our bridges, we just, let's see here. Did that click? Okay, very good, thank you. Certainly something that is difficult to maintain for us in House Bill 2017. We had anticipated that by 2030, we would have expected more than 30% of our bridges on our high priority state highway corridors would be in poor condition. Obviously, if we are needing to weight or length restrict any of our bridges, that has a corollary issue with our economy. Thanks to House Bill 2017, again, we're around the 20% level. These investments, of course, save us money in the long term, and we've talked about the investment. We had a discussion at lunch. Do we want to pay for it now or do we want to pay for it later? We will be paying for it. So I think this is a recognition in terms of that. Moving on to improving safety. Safety is a key value that was woven into the work that we did going around the state, again, with the Visioning Panel. 2 programs in particular, and the legislation of House Bill 2017 put forward $10 million into making our highways safer through we have $10 million a year, raising to $15 million by 2023 for a Safe Routes to School program. And that, of course, will help us be able to make improvements of getting kids biking and walking to schools and making those critical investments. It'll go to both local roads and state highways, and we'll be focused on high crash corridors near schools where kids are most in danger. Next, to local control and also the partnership between local government and our state. 50% increase in total state funding resources will go to cities and counties. Half of the road funding will go to their top priorities for maintenance and improvements, and 50% increase to parts of our state that have not had any money to put into capital improvements is clearly something that will help build our system going forward. Next, funding for small cities and counties, and I'm sure that each of you work closely with those organizations. There was a recognition of making sure that those minimum grant counties and cities had an opportunity to also be able to meet their needs. House Bill 2017 ensures that those with small populations will receive an adequate amount of funding. So cities with populations under 5,000, there is a pool of $5 million that allows them to receive some grants that will help them address their transportation needs. And the bill also set aside $5 million of county funds that will also help create a pool for them to be able to draw from as well. So let's get on to the gas tax. So motor fuels tax increase 10 cents over 6 years. This was no easy lift for our legislative body. We are moving toward a user pays model, and kind of what Paul had mentioned as well. To pay for highway investments, the increase in the gas tax and vehicle registration fees and title fees will happen over this 6-year period. And there are some conditions that are attached to our gas tax increase. Our registration fees are stepped and tiered as well, as you can see. And those for surcharges for electric vehicles and hybrids that pay little in gas tax will ensure that they do pay for their wear and tear in a way of the roads as well. So what does this mean to the average person driving through or who live in Oregon? A typical driver will pay about $6 more a month, and the average driver will pay about 0.8 cents per mile more to get better roads. And if you look at the cost of a vehicle with roads in terms of potholes and deterioration, it actually is a cost savings. Moving on next to our total automobile-related taxes. So we will be tied with Montana as we are ranked 5th out of 51, which includes the District of Columbia in terms of what it costs in Oregon. But moving on also to trucks, which we get asked a lot about in terms of are they paying their fair share? And light and heavy vehicles share in the revenue of House Bill 2017. The Constitution requires that light and heavy vehicles in Oregon pay their fair share. About 1/3 of the new state highway revenue will come from trucks and about 2/3 coming from light vehicles. The weight mile tax increase is in 4 steps over 6 years, and a variety of the truck taxes and fees will increase. The weight mile tax will increase in 4 steps beginning next year, and that is a total of just over 50%. So a priority for us, of course, is multimodal investments, making sure that we are investing in all opportunities for non-highway modes, freeing up space on our crowded highways. Better public transportation, as noted within the joint visioning panel that we worked on, as a significant investment in bus service in both rural and urban areas is necessary to provide choices in helping people get around. Also helps with greenhouse gas emissions. So in House Bill 2017 is a 0.1% tax on wages that will generate around $100 million a year. This will cost the average worker less than $1 a week. But for the state of Oregon to do a payroll tax, that was, I can't believe we got there. So, and again, Oregon does not have, of course, as you know, a sales tax. So we are tax adverse in a lot of respects. So it was good to see that go through. I think it's also important to note that for public transit in Oregon, a number of those providing transit opportunities do not have base funding, and so it's 100% grant funded, and that is not it's truly by just a lot of tenacity that some of those services are continuing forward, so this is a much needed investment. So Statewide Transportation Investment Fund, and so this is how the funds will roll out. About 90% of the funding will go directly to transit districts, counties, and Native American tribal governments that submit plans for improvements. So the funds are not for it is for expansion of services to make sure that we are enhancing what we currently have. Some of the money will be used for intercity connections between communities, as well as requiring to improve services to low-income residents and those that rely on public transportation. Next, moving on to safe walking and biking. Oh, let's see here. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Moving freight through ConnectOregon. The ConnectOregon program has been one that we have really relied on in terms of other modes in our state. A portion of a new 0.5% vehicle dealer privilege tax on new light vehicles will go to ConnectOregon to improve rail, ports, and other modes. So products, of course, from our farms and forests and factories can get to market all across the world. New intermodal rail facilities in the Willamette Valley and Eastern Oregon will shift freight from truck to train, freeing up more of our space on our highways as well. However, most of the revenue from the vehicle dealer privilege tax on light vehicles will go for rebates for zero-emission vehicle purchases that will help us transition to a more sustainable transportation system. I'm sorry, I seem to have a little... Okay, congestion relief. If you want to narrow the field of individuals that are sending you love notes, talk about value pricing. And we on the bus came right through a toll. It's not new in Oregon, but it is certainly something that is garnering a lot of interest for individuals. So House Bill 2017 doesn't just address the congestion of widening. It also seeks to reduce congestion and improve reliability by using price signals through tolling and value pricing. So value pricing on I-5 and 205. Okay, here we go. Sorry. We have just completed a 25-member value pricing Advisory Committee recently gave a presentation to the Transportation Commission outlining their recommendations. The recommendations for the Portland metropolitan area is to toll the I-5 lanes through the Rose Quarter as well as on or near the Abernathy Bridge, which is in I-205. We will be having a discussion later this week with the Transportation Commission as to whether or not that is a recommendation that we will be moving forward with. We do need to submit to the Federal Highway Administration a plan by December, and that was a directive from our legislative body. In addition to this, we also have a recognition of the entire area in the Portland metropolitan area needs to be addressed in terms of congestion, but also what type of analysis and process do we want to use to have that conversation. So that will be ongoing. Next, we move on to accountability and transparency. As you can imagine, with an unprecedented amount of additional funding, the transparency requirements for us to tell the public what it is that we're spending those funds on is critical. So part of the gas tax increase is predicated on us reporting the putting in place standards for bridge and pavement conditions for ODOT and local governments to follow, receiving and posting on the internet the reports of local governments on their bridge and pavement conditions, and then also completing a number of projects and reporting on the status of other projects are required for us to move forward with additional funding. Moving on to, of course, with the opportunity to have extra funding, the Transportation Commission's role was something that the legislature wanted us to take a look at as well. And so within House Bill 2017, it increases the Commission's oversight responsibility, starting with the the director of the Department of Transportation now is overseen by the Transportation Commission, which is a change from the governor. In addition to that, there we are. It also requires cost-benefit analysis of major highway expansion projects to ensure that we are getting a good return on the investment. It also creates a committee, the Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee, which helps us in terms of maximizing efficiencies, setting measures to gauge ODOT's performance, and helping us with our key performance measures. And lastly, enhances the role of our auditor to make sure that we have clear direction of where we're heading, and that position also has independence. We have a transparency website, and that will show where the projects are. So if you want to see what's happening in Oregon, especially if you're traveling through where some of the construction may be. And then it's important to note out that, of course, that the Oregon Constitution requires that all money raised by the gas tax, registration, and title fees be spent on our roadways, of which we remain committed to. So with that, it's Keep Oregon Moving, and that's an overview of House Bill 2017 and what we've been working on since the last time that we were with you. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Tammy. So next, Mitch, I think you're batting cleanup here.
Thank you. I'm Mitch Weiss with the California Transportation Commission. The Transportation Commission is an independent body within California state government. It's made up of 13 members, 9 members appointed by the governor, 2 members appointed by the legislature, and 2 non-voting ex officio legislative members. The commission is responsible for programming and allocating funds for the construction of highway, passenger rail, transit, general aviation, and active transportation improvements across California. The commission also advises and assists the California State Transportation Agency Secretary and the legislature in formulating and evaluating state policies and plans for California's transportation programs. For many years, our biggest issue here in California was funding. Until last year, the last time we raised the gas and diesel excise taxes was 1994, more than 2 decades. So the rates were stagnant. Inflation was eroding the buying power of the gas tax. By the time the gas tax was increased, our base excise tax of 18 cents was worth less than 8 cents per gallon. The infrastructure was aging. So, as anybody who's a homeowner knows, if you have your house getting older, you're not maintaining it, the cost to do what you need to are going to go up, and we were seeing that on our state highway system. Year after year, we were producing reports showing us farther in the hole to maintain our highway system. And then people were using it more. Because of fuel efficiency, that increased usage was coming with people paying less per mile to maintain our roads. So we too, as with about half the states in the United States, received new funding recently. In 2017, the legislature and the administration approved the first significant, stable, and ongoing increase in transportation funding in more than 2 decades. In total, Senate Bill 1 will raise more than $5 billion a year. It's roughly half of it controlled by the state and half controlled by local agencies. And over 80% of it will flow through the Transportation Commission in some way. It's raised the gas tax, diesel excise tax, diesel sales tax, and added a new transportation improvement fee, which is at vehicle registration based on the value of the vehicle, a new zero emission vehicle registration fee to take effect in 2020. And all of those ad valorem taxes are linked to inflation. In addition to raising revenue, SB 1, known as the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, focuses on maintenance and rehabilitation and increases transparency and accountability. This is a snapshot of the SB 1 funding programs for which the Commission has responsibility, in which we've approved projects or project lists. We've approved more than $9 billion in SB 1 funding, and that's a total project value of more than $25 billion. It's more than 4,000 projects in every city and county in California. So we do have a little challenge with our new revenue. Proposition 6, which will be on the ballot this November, would repeal all the new revenues and would require any future revenues to be approved by a popular vote. And so thousands of projects across the state would lose funding. So one of the things that wouldn't go away with the revenue repeals are some of the other things that we've been doing in the state and some of the legislative goals. We are required, or the state requires, that the Department of Transportation, in consultation with the Commission, prepare a robust asset management plan. This plan was adopted in March and is used to guide the selection of projects in the State Highway Operation and Maintenance Program, Operation and Protection Program, which is our program to really preserve and protect the state highway system. And Senate Bill 1 defined targets in 10-year targets in 4 asset classes. These targets will remain in statute even if the revenue to do the work goes away. In May, the Commission adopted targets for a number of nine other asset classifications. ADA is not on that list, should be. With the SB1, the legislature increased the Commission's authority to hold the Department of Transportation and local agencies accountable for how they spend transportation tax revenue. The Commission's main goals in increasing transparency and accountability and in developing guidelines are twofold. We want implementing agencies to clearly identify specific deliverable outcomes, and we want to ensure that the tax dollars programmed by the Commission are spent on projects the way they were proposed to and adopted by the Commission. The Commission has adopted program-specific guidelines for each of the programs under its purview. In addition, we've adopted overarching accountability and transparency guidelines. These accountability guidelines call for baseline agreements for most projects in competitive programs and all the large projects in the State Highway Operation and Protection Program. The baseline agreements will be signed by the Executive Director of the implementing agency, the Director of the Department of Transportation, and the Commission's Executive Director, and will document the outcomes, expected benefits, costs, scope, and schedule of the projects. The accountability guidelines also identify reporting requirements, including both in-progress reports, completion reports, and final delivery reports. Additionally, the Commission now makes project-specific capital outlay support allocations for Caltrans's State Highway Operation and Protection Program, which really establishes a firm budget for these expenditures and improves transparency and accountability. Other SB1 accountability measures include the creation of an independent Office of Audits and Investigations led by an Inspector General. The Inspector General is appointed by the Governor, confirmed by the Senate, and cannot be removed from office during her tenure except for good cause. The Inspector General is required to report annually to the Governor, the Legislature, and the Commission with a summary of findings and recommendations. SB1 also created an advanced mitigation program funded at $30 million a year for 4 years to accelerate project delivery while meeting or exceeding environmental requirements. And also SB1 required the Department of Transportation to generate $100 million per year in annual savings and report on those savings to the Commission. The Commission is also working to support the state's environmental goals, and with many of the new SB1 competitive programs, we've included greenhouse gas reduction in the program evaluation criteria. VMT reduction is an issue that was a subject of considerable discussion at the Commission's recent joint meeting with the Air Resources Board, and a number of the new SB1 competitive programs explicitly or implicitly include VMT reductions as a part of project selection criteria. The Commission staff has been working in recent years to better engage with environmental and environmental justice stakeholders throughout the state. We've held last year and are continuing this year a series of listening sessions. And with that, I guess we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks. How about some questions for our panelists? Yes, Jim.
One quick question for Washington and one perhaps longer question for Oregon. Washington, in your slide presentation, you had one slide that showed that by next year you expected 71% of your gas tax to be going towards debt service or bonds. And then the next slide shows, in a pie chart, shows 17%. Is that a different universe of funding, or how do you, there's a difference in those two numbers that I'm confused about?
Thank you. So the one slide, it's slide 6, I believe, shows currently about 50% of the gas tax revenue coming to the state and not redistributed out to cities and counties is going to pay off bonds that have been issued. By 2027, that'll reach 71%. Then the next slide was looking specifically at the Connecting Washington $16 billion spending program, and that's showing that 17% of that revenue is going to be paying off debt from prior projects.
Okay, great, thanks. For Oregon, I thought I heard you say that under legislation, the Transportation Commission now now selects, or the Department of Transportation head, or?
Correct. So,
Can you tell me, kind of what was behind that and how the conversation went?
well, as you can imagine, it was an interesting discussion. It was around transparency and accountability, and I think that years ago, 15 years ago, the director of ODOT was actually the commission structure was appointed by the commission, and that was maybe revisiting how that structure had been in the past. So actually, it was a very positive discussion. It's in consultation with the governor, so it's not as though the Transportation Commission is completely autonomous through that discussion of the appropriate appointment and oversight. But clearly, with the connection between the authorities that are embedded within the laws that outline our role and responsibilities, that connection with the executive director is critical. So it allows us an opportunity to work with the governor's office in terms of that oversight, but clearly if there were a challenge with meeting needs or project delivery, or if there were challenges, it allows the Transportation Commission to have more of an opportunity to weigh in.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Tammy, I'm going to put you on the hot seat.
Go right ahead.
I think the state of Texas has a similar situation where the commission oversees the director of transportation. Who decides the salary range? Is that up to the legislature, or do you guys set it for the executive director?
So we have not crossed that bridge yet, and no pun intended, but it'll be a good bridge though, in good condition. So it's structurally, yes, sound. The current director is, so we're changing a structure without changing our current setup. So the director is same director. So that was already set in terms of through the governor's office, and that appointment had already been made, obviously, for many years, and we're quite happy. Going forward, I think there is a discussion about how that would be set. Clearly, the legislature sets our budget and would allow for what that would look like. We haven't had that discussion, so I can't tell you how well that would go. But that I suspect that we would have history play into the future in terms of where we would be in cultivating someone if we were to make a change at any point, but it would be at the discretion of the OTC to make the request for that appointment. And the way that the language is structured is that it is in consultation with the governor, but the OTC has the appointing authority for that individual. So where those lines get drawn in terms of what we pay and how that's set, part of that is within our budget authority through the legislative process, but we have not had a test on that yet.
Well, I applaud you for making that happen. I think it's the right approach.
Well, and it's in the how you manage that. One of the questions that I had asked was around performance evaluations as the chair, and some of that just had not occurred. And from a business perspective, making sure that the executive director is meeting the needs of both the legislature, the governor, and the Transportation Commission, as well as the public. I just think it buttons it up a little bit better, and it's been a positive discussion.
Do we have other questions? Okay, then I'm going to do chair's privilege and ask one. So we're trying to learn from each other, but that can be what not to do or what not, or what we should do. So talk to us, Paul, a little bit about the dueling 20-year plans, because I'm thinking that's something that maybe wouldn't be the top of our list.
So our legislature has directed the commission to do a long-range 20-year transportation plan, and it also has directed the Department of Transportation to do that. I think that that may be due to the fact that we used to have a different organizational structure where the commission oversaw the Department of Transportation, so there was more unity with that dual direction. However, it's been pointed out to the legislature several times since the split of the commission and the department happened in 2005, and the legislature has not chosen to change the statutes. However, the legislature has told both the commission and the department that it wants one plan. And it's been very explicit about that with that direction, and it's also said we want one state plan, and we want that one state plan also to meet the federal requirements for state to continue to receive transportation funding. So what we have done is engaged in conversation with the Department of Transportation and suggested that the one that the commission does is a high-level policy plan, a strategic plan, and that their job in turn is to produce more of an implementation plan based on following from the policy plan that we do and more oriented toward the transportation department's own, what they own and operate, as well as key transportation facilities for the state. When we completed the last four-year plan in 2035, they then took our 2035 plan and began to develop their implementation strategy from it, and earlier this year adopted their long-range plan based on what we had done, and are packaging the two pieces together to hand that over to FHWA as Washington's unified long-range statewide transportation plan.
I'd say, okay. Well, thank you. I am going to interrupt our agenda. We have been joined by someone that we all know and love in our state. Not everybody. Well, generally speaking. So we've been joined by Congressman Mark James DeSaulnier. How about that? I did my homework and looked up the middle name. But
That's
we
what
could
my mother
ask
used
him.
to call me when I was in trouble.
That's why I used it.
Yes,
Yes. No. Which bridge did you drive over today? No, let's go. Anyway, Mark has been an amazing public servant, served on the local, regional, in our state legislature, was an ex officio member of our commission, and it was very entertaining for all of us. We loved it when he was here. And then in 2014, he was elected to Congress. And for those of you that don't know Mark, you should get to know him because he sits on the House T&I committee. And I'm sure he's here today to tell us about the wonderful infrastructure bill. And all our headaches will be solved. So with that, join me in welcoming Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. Thank you. Well, I remember one moment when Mr. Gilmetti was chair at one of my meetings on the commission, and I was chair. I was on the commission, state law in California, for those of you from Oregon and Washington, lets the chair of the Transportation Committee in each house be ex officio. And someone who was the chair then kept whining about the fact, kept expressing the fact that we should go to more of the meetings. We went, and you were saying something to the effect, it was in Sacramento, that you hoped that the elected officials who were there were listening. And I said, what did you say? Anyways, I'm delighted to be here Jim had asked me to stop by because of your interest in your work on VMT in particular. I was the author in California of our pilot project that was modeled after Oregon. I said once publicly I got more death threats from that bill than any other bill, but worse than that, I kept getting asked on Fox National News. But it's gone well, and we struggle with this about how we pay for infrastructure. There are issues around VMT, as you all know, but we have to find a source, obviously, as gas tax continues to go down. And I'm interested in, as all of you, three states continue to do that. I will say that I went to Washington State a couple times with the current director of our transportation agency, Brian Ennis, to look at the wonderful work that you've done up there on performance standards in the Gray Book. I was delighted to find out that the reason it was called the Gray Book was that they went down and had the first one published at a Kinko's, and that's what they got, was just a Gray Book. But I very much admire the work you've done. I've frequently in Congress, I say the kind of reforms that we need at a federal level we can find in states like Washington, Minnesota, and Massachusetts that are doing great jobs on performance-based transportation planning. And in California, we are attempting to do the same thing. So with that, I'll just end with and be happy to answer any questions. Two things. First off, we will have an infrastructure bill if the leadership in the House changes. Ranking Member DeFazio from Oregon is in his inimitable style, very forceful about his opinions. Peter and I both grew up in Boston. He retained his New England crankiness, which we love and admire. But I'm quite convinced that we are going to have a bill that will keep the discussion going, depending on what happens in the midterm elections. But the key thing is identifying funding. And what's a bridge? Do we raise the gas tax federally, which we need to, and index it for inflation? Would the administration sign such a bill? But I think the discussion will become more robust after the midterms should we be in leadership positions. And then lastly, I'd just tell you a wonderful trip. Peter came down, I don't know, about a year ago, and we went to Uber, their self-driving truck, which they have since pulled out of. We spent quite a bit of time at Waymo and Tesla, and I'll tell you how the story, the visit ended. We were driving up 19th Avenue to the Golden Gate Bridge, and Peter was talking to the chair of the Oregon State Democratic Party, and he said, "I've just seen the future." And I said, "Peter, you're stuck in traffic." So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'd really love to follow the work you're all doing and see if we can replicate it in the Congress.
Thanks, Mark. Questions? Oh, my goodness.
Well, this
How
is
can
a first.
this be?
Well, Alvarado's
can't
out of the room, so that's a blessing.
Okay, well, I'm going to stall a little bit till Bobby gets back, so.
Can I?
Of course, Rima.
So Rima Griffith with the Washington Commission. So we're in the middle of a road charge pilot right now, and we've been talking with our congressional delegation about getting some airtime before Congress. These were all most of these are federally funded pilots through the grant that was given to USDOT and FHWA. So do you think there's hope in the next year that some of the states can come back and actually start reporting out on their work and that's being funded by federal dollars to help kind of jumpstart a more active discussion around alternative transportation funding, whether it be road charging or some other form of
Well, at least from my perspective, absolutely. I mean, we have, as you well know, $3 trillion worth of unmet needs. We have to identify the funding, and we need to be aggressive. It's one of the best things we could do for the country. And at the same time, we compare the United States to developing countries, China in particular. They're investing very heavily. So if we don't invest, there's plenty of research, as you all know, that will make our economy not as robust as it should be. Peter and I also started a Urban Studies Caucus. We had Richard Florida, if you've read his work, The Rise of the Creative Class, and Richard's theory is, I think, Carl, you and I talked about this at once, that the new anchors in the knowledge-based economy are research facilities, public and private, and that's why Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Boston, DC are doing so well. But we haven't figured out yet in his most recent book, after he wrote Rise of the Creative Classes, The New Urban Crisis, is what do we do about affordable housing? What do we do about income inequality? What do we do about congestion? Having been involved in this California for a long time, and when I started here, it was such a traditional car dependent, that was
a big part of our culture. Now that we have the urbanization that makes bigger investments in transit make more sense, it's ironic that we're struggling, which is happening all around the country, Boston, New York, Washington. Our transit agencies are struggling with multiple things, behavioral health issues. Los Angeles has just is hiring full-time staff persons on behavioral health to deal with some of the homelessness issues they have. Sacramento did that some time ago. So all of these things, I think, I feel a real sense of urgency for the state, the country, particularly younger people in the economy, that we engage in a robust discussion with you. Was it Brandeis who said that the state should be the laboratories, and you are. Much to my, I look back and I think, God, I had a really cool job when I was in the state legislature. And now we struggle in Washington and other parts of the country as opposed to the West Coast with trying new things. So it's really important that you three states continue to be innovative because you really lead the country.
Commissioner Dunn?
Thank you. It's so hard for me not to call you Senator DeSaulnier. It seems like Congressman. I know that's a bigger title, but
not necessarily. I had more power when I was a state senator.
So Congressman DeSaulnier, and I know you also know this too, but one of the big issues, I think, I'm a huge fan, having participated in the road pilot project myself, these innovative states, and the West Coast is doing it. We also know the East Coast is doing it. But just to keep on your radar screen, again, I know you already know this, I think a game changer would be when the Auto Club really steps up, because they will support this if it's a national program. And they have when they've got like a 75% market share of drivers that love the Auto Club, let's not forget to keep them engaged in this discussion, because at the end of the day, I really do think that it helps folks think about their trips and think about congestion relief without actually making it painful. So if that's something to keep on your radar as you're looking for that next bill.
No, that's a great suggestion. I know how influential they are here in California, and their AAA's Northern California office is directly across the street from my Walnut Creek District office, so I will wander across the street. I'll take any more questions from anyone but Mr. Gilmetti.
Bobby's up now.
Good choice.
Or Alvarado. You can see, for those of you from other states, what respect they have for their members of the delegation.
I had a quick question, as you identified a couple of things that are of major concern, not only statewide, but also in our metropolitan region of Portland, which is income disparities and housing affordability, and how the urban centers are becoming essentially these hubs where are not affordable for people who are living on lower means. What role do you see the infrastructure playing in trying to restore and rebuild that middle income America? Because what we're facing is that whole demographic of folks in this country are essentially going away.
Yeah.
And so, and I think about this all the time, but I was just curious as to what your thoughts are, and potentially maybe if it plays a role in some way, shape, or form as it relates to our historic gas tax that hasn't moved a penny ever since I was in the 5th grade. So, just curious about that.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. When I was in the legislature, I started something called EPIC, Ending Poverty and Inequality in California, and we didn't have a earned income state credit, to believe it or not, in California. That was one of the big things we were able to do, and not as large as I would like, but Governor Brown was in his usual fiscal position, didn't want to give as much, but we have to address this, as Mr. Florida has written in his research, is quite compelling. If we're going to continue the benefit of urbanization in these 3 metropolitan areas, and I would add Los Angeles and San Diego, we're going to have to figure this out. You need to, I just had, I was the only politician invited, I'm trying to get my Google San Francisco building down here in the Embarcadero to a meeting on the future of work. And this was a big part of that discussion is, and I know Carl has been very involved in this in the South Bay. This is a really large problem. We have people living in our mega commutes. I think we have 4 of the 10 largest ones in the United States in the Bay Area, something like that. So people going out and driving 2 miles back in and living in their cars. I know just started a program in Santa Clara County, Supervisor Sumidi in a former corridor where he worked with faith-based institutions to get insurance and let people sleep in their RVs in church parking lots down there because they're driving 2 hours in, and rather than doing it 4 days a week, they do it and then stay, work their 4 shifts or 5 shifts and then go back out 2 hours away because it's the only place they can afford to live. So this is a really, for me, a huge sense of urgency for multiple reasons, for the economy, for what we aspire to in terms of equality for people, and also being the father of 2 sons who are in their 30s who live in Los Angeles, and they struggle to figure out where they would like to get the 20% down payment to buy a house at some point and settle down. Whereas when we did that, my generation, my first house I bought in Pleasant Hill, about 20 miles from here, for $72,000, and we've got to deal with those issues. And it's really a problem. And I know the legislature and the governor in this state, that's what they're working on right now. That's their priority, is housing.
And one last thing as it relates to that, is there anything that essentially we could be learning from, whether Washington, California, both you guys feel free to chime in, but as it relates to the public sector's role as it's communicating and negotiating with private developers? Because as we're talking about transportation, this is not just one siloed conversation. It connects to so many other facets of the economy and the ecosystem that we all live in and share. But my question is whether or not if there's palatable examples that you guys have in terms of working with private developers and market forces who essentially are saying they have to achieve a certain return on their investment, and how you're making their investments work to create more transit-oriented and sustainable development models that are not forcing folks to rely on single occupancy vehicles.
Yeah, I should mention Barbara Lee, who's a more senior member who represents Oakland and Berkeley, a neighboring district to mine. We're going to have a town hall with researchers from the UC system about gentrification, who benefits, how we can make sure people don't get left behind. So that's a big issue. I think whatever we can do, I have a bill that would replicate what we do with university transportation schools in HUD, and we're working with some language where they can coordinate so that we can give grants out, federal grants out to housing schools to have these kind of discussions. And I would add, if we can do it with labor institutes and institutes for the study of poverty and inequality at places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Stanford, I think we'd get some real value added for those discussions about what we could do. And I appreciate the question very much, because I'm being redundant, but the sense of urgency. And then lastly, one of the things I was shocked, my predecessor, who had been in Congress for 40 years, told me, Mark, you're going to have to get used to the fact that your colleagues aren't like people from California. And I said, well, that's fairly patronizing. He said, okay, smart guy, you call me when you find this out. And the joke was, 2 weeks after I got sworn in, I called him. The difference between the West Coast and the rest of the country, with some pockets, our ability to take chances and be innovative, we talk about this a lot like it's a cliche, but it's really true. So I really wanted to come here just to reinforce that to you. You're so important to the country's future when we talk about issues like this, because you will experiment in ways, just by virtue of your public and private culture, that most of the rest of the country won't do. They're afraid of failing. And on the West Coast, we're not.
Commissioner Medaford, would you have
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for being here. And, to your last comment, what I think you're going to hear, I don't know how much time you have. I know you were just limited, but we're going to, next on our agenda is an update from Oregon, Washington, and California on what we've done with our road charge effort. And I'm very proud to say the effort that we've had in California, just to your point, and thanks again to 1077 that you authored, has really set a standard. And the piece that we're in now, where we're actually investigating the next stops, which might include pay at the pump and some other models, to make the administrative cost a lot less. Those are really the areas to focus on, to where we can start utilizing technology that's already being delivered in cars manufactured today. So what we're doing here, figuring out what you can do as the political winds change to where we can see that kind of leadership exerted on a national level is going to be very important for the whole country, because we're not going to have a lot of time. As we all know, gas tax revenues continue to do this, and it's something that financially, the federal government as well as all our states are at risk.
I'd just add, having spent 10 years as an appointee of 2 Republican governors and 1 Democrat on the California Air Resources Board, 2 of the issues with VMT is, first, what do we do about continuing to incentivize people to buy alternative fuel vehicles and not punishing them when we try to ramp up and the production to get higher? And then the other issue on inequality is young people having to travel further and further out. So I'm sure you've addressed those things, but those are things that I hear frequently. And then the privacy issues, it's always interesting telling people that in Portland you can choose to just have your odometer read, and it's funny how the light goes on right away with people. It's like, oh, that seems pretty simple. So
we did the same thing here in California.
Yeah. Copy Oregon, not a bad rule. Don't tell anybody out there in California.
I have a quick question, and then I'm saving the last comment over here for my buddy to my right. But, Mark, one of the things in front of us was consideration to send your colleagues a letter from the 3 commissions jointly talking about the work we've done and encouraging. Do you have any suggestions for us in terms, I mean, you talked about the West Coast maybe being viewed as a little differently, but what better can we share with your colleagues across the U.S. to encourage them to follow our lead?
Well, I think they look at us, my perception is, with this odd paradox of envy and admiration. We're experiencing, all of us experience really robust economies. So many patents come from our 3 states now, vastly disproportionate. Venture capital is vastly disproportionate once you get out of Manhattan. So I think it's, I guess it's as much tone as anything, as we're experimenting, and we want to let you know the things we've found when we've experimented. And as I say, there are other states that are doing that. Minnesota and Massachusetts come to mind.
Great. So I'm not seeing any other. Oh, wait, hold off, Jim. I got a couple more, and I think you want to
have
wrap
Senator
up.
Keogh ask me a question.
I think she does. She's ready.
It's a pleasure to hear your comments. For all 3 states on the West Coast, freight mobility is a big thing. I want to draw a little parallel analogy based on a WARDA bill, which is the Water Resource Development Act bill, which Congress started many years ago. And they were not fully funding it. So the barges and shippers came to the Congress and said, we will tax ourselves. And so that you can do the infrastructure so that we can move freely all the goods and services along Ohio River and Columbia River system. Similar analogy can be drawn parallel for freight mobility. Perhaps we should be creating a truck lane and asking the trucking industry to tax themselves so that they can move the freight up and down the coast and all the major freeway system. Is that something can be done at the federal level?
It is. I'm mindful of some years ago being in Europe and being in Berlin, talking with the Minister of Transportation when they were considering this, and the rest of the EU states were not very enthusiastic, but they have gone ahead and, as I understand, have done some of what you've said in terms of a road charge. So I think we should look at these things and, again, experiment with them and learn from our experimentation. And the freight industry in California, their big problem with the vehicle weight fee when Chris and I were in the legislature was they wanted to make sure that it went where it was intended to go, because we frequently borrowed from that for other services. So spend it. The trucking company, in my experience, was always pretty good about this. They were willing to raise their vehicle weight fees, provided it went back into maintaining the infrastructure. And they were good partners legislatively.
Commissioner Kehoe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hi, Mark. It's very good to see you.
Chris, nice to see you. Reminds me of that trip to Moscow.
I think we're all aware that California is on a collision course with the administration about emissions and our ability to try to maintain clean air standards here in California. Care to share any thoughts on that and how you you see any chances for a resolution or compromise?
So I've been very involved with this because of California and my experience on the Air Resources Board, and having had a long experience with the car manufacturers. The midterm review is an appropriate way. I think the administration just, in a very ham-handed way, got in the middle of what would have been a normal discussion about what's working and what isn't, and do we have to adjust the timelines and the inventory. I hope that that'll happen. I've been told Representative Dingell, who represents Ann Arbor and most of the American auto manufacturers, we work on this very closely. Ms. Dingell is the wife of John Dingell, who chaired the Energy Committee for many years, was in Congress for 50 years, was a very strong defender of auto manufacturers and their right to build whatever they wanted. But personally, I think there's no reason why California and the other 12 states, including Washington and Oregon, can't keep doing what they're doing in terms of making the fleet more efficient and cleaner for both carbon and traditional pollutants. But I fear that some in the car industry decided this administration was an opportunity to cut it back as far as possible. So I have a bill that would make it very clear that the California waiver is legal. We think it's legal, and we think we'll pass those tests in court. The administration can't undo a statute that was signed 50 years ago and had bipartisan support and has worked really well. But just to make it clear, I have 60 co-authors, unfortunately no Republicans yet. And I've started a process, and there's bills in the legislature, or draft bills, that would penalize auto manufacturers who decide not to adhere to the California standards. So we would prohibit state and local governments in California from, as part of their procurement process, there would be a penalty if the car manufacturer was deviating from the CARB standards. And I have had conversations with people at both Lyft and Uber about doing that in the private sector. So if they're gonna, the message right now to the auto manufacturers, and I've had these conversations with them, if you're going to go too far, then you're going to have a real fight from all of us. But if you want to work with us, CARB has always been good at that, is if we've overreached and it's not realistic, then let's have a discussion about how we make it work. And you know that, your position.
Thanks. Good.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, let's hope it works.
Commissioner Gilmetti.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
Yeah.
There's an absence of a quorum out in the parking lot.
First of all, I'd like to welcome you to your new MTC building.
Why did you have to bring that up?
You're very proud of. And secondly, I wanted to compliment you.
Jim, don't laugh at his humor. It's not funny.
I wanted to compliment you. I'm here to compliment you how much smarter you've gotten in the last 4 years.
Well, you know, I'm glad that an Italian-American can say that about a French-American. For those of you not from California, this building has some history. It was paid for with toll funds, and I didn't think that was the right way to pay for it since my constituents disproportionately contributed to it. So I said I would never step foot in this building. I did, and it was for Bobby Alvarado, not for Mr. Gilmetti. Well, thank you all very much. I look forward to working with you. I feel strongly that your delegations, our delegations in California and yours, want to partner with you, and maybe there's an opportunity where we could do something similar with the delegation that you're doing here today. If there's a way to institutionalize that either here on the West Coast or back in DC, it would be really helpful, I think, and for our staff to do it as well.
Well, we would look forward to that. We would look forward to that. And I'm looking at our staff over there. I have just one closing message for you, Mark. So can you roll the photo, Doug?
Why do I think this is not going to be good?
It's how I spent my morning, Mark. So hold on just 1 second.
Hopefully technology won't work here.
There you go.
Geez. Madam Chair, that's too subtle for a member of Congress. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Sorry, guys, I couldn't pass that opportunity to get that little commercial in there. So, anyway, back to our discussion. I think, were there any more comments on the three or questions about lessons to learn from each other or to avoid from each other or anything else? I think to me, what was strong was the maintenance and preservation. We have all clearly recognized that that's a huge issue. I think the recent activity of the fundraising shows that at least some folks have been listening to us, but I think we still have a long way to go. I know in our state, our commission worked very hard to get our programs out the door, our dollars out the door, and we saw a pothole on one of the slides, if not more, saying that that was the first thing everybody wanted to talk to you about. So we get it. So I think that message. And then also the jobs housing balance and the implications and the impacts on the transportation demands. I think we have a lot of work to do. We've recently had at our commission the head of our housing department. I think it might have been the first time that we actually asked him to come to our hearing, and we plan to do it on a real regular basis because we realize that in providing mobility options, those questions of housing and jobs are so very important for all of us. So with that, we will move on. Is everybody okay? Or we keep working here? Everybody's good? We can still keep going? So we're going to go to item number 3 and talk about our road usage charges state by state. So once again, I think we're going to start with the great state of Washington.
Thank you. So I'll jump right in here, and we'll talk a little bit about the kind of backdrop, legislative direction, and give you an overview of the pilot. So, you've heard a little bit of this from Oregon and of course, Paul and California, but we're all kind of facing that same kind of backdrop on funding sustainability. In Washington State, we have the third highest gas tax. We were the second highest, but we've slipped behind California. Thank you. So we are now the third highest state, and along with that as Paul had in that chart, we're heavily leveraged. Our legislature likes to take every penny and bond it. And so we've got a little bit of that issue. We've raised our gas tax 3 times since 2003. It was a nickel in 03, and then in 05 they came in and did 9.5 cents. And then we sat for a while, and then in 15 they did a 2-tiered increase, totaling 11.9 cents. And in the midst of that last push to raise the gas tax, we were talking about road charging. And it was semi-public. I mean, we weren't hiding it, but we weren't out doing a big rollout. And so there was a little bit of media attention around, they're trying to raise our gas tax, but they're telling us it's not sustainable. So what's the deal? And we're in debt, and we're paying all this tax. So there's a little bit of a challenge on the optics with the public in terms of how we're talking about it and the need, because there's a sense that there's a lot of money on the table. We have $16 billion they just invested over the next 16 years. So, why are you telling us? And our gas tax in Washington State is flat. It's not growing. So for us, that's at least a yellow flag, because typically in a booming economy, you would see your gas tax revenues going up. And we're riding on a flat line right now. We're not going down yet, but we are all anticipating that with our forecast. So with those kind of challenges on an optics side and kind of a factual side with the public, it's been a bit of a challenge, but we've been plowing forward with this discussion now in a much more public way. And in 2012, the legislature directed the commission to start working on identifying a sustainable long-term funding source for transportation to replace the gas tax. And in our state, the gas tax is state constitutionally bound for highway purposes. So that alone creates a little bit of debate around if we're going to shift the paradigm, do we really not want to shift it and rethink its usages? Should it not be open to public transportation and other uses? That's kind of percolating on the side, but right now the legislature has said it's a replacement, and so we should take that literally. The commission was directed to establish a multi-member stakeholder or steering committee. It's got about 27 people on it right now, representing a whole host of stakeholders from across the state who are from the private and public sector, working with us really since 2012 hand in hand on this issue in a consensus basis. And some of the hallmark priorities of the committee have been that there be consumer choice if this goes forward, that we should not mandate a particular approach to collecting road charging, that there should be tech-based ones, and there needs to be manual our non-tech-based approaches as well. So we are in our pilot testing both. And during any transition, from gas tax to RUC, drivers would be required to pay one but not both, which is also kind of a hot button in our public discussions of worrisomes about being double taxed per se for the roads. So there would have to be some kind of credit. And then lastly, we're not looking at heavy trucks in our pilot at all. And the reason we've kind of set aside the commercial trucks is because in our state, every time they've raised the gas tax, they've raised the weight fees significantly to the tune of about 15%. So they are paying a lot right now for the roads, and they have been a big supporter of those revenue packages. So it was an agreement with legislators and folks on our steering committee that not be part of this pilot right now. So quick snapshot, our pilot is fully federally funded. We got $3.8 million for the design and setup that's complete now, and now we're into stage 2. We got another $4.6 million in federal money to do the live pilot as well as the evaluation reporting on the tail end. Basically, it's a year-long, 12-month pilot with 2,000 drivers from across the state. We're actively partnering with the Oregon Department of Transportation, the City of Surrey, BC, Idaho DOT, and then the Seattle Electric Vehicle Association and Plug-in America. And we're testing right now a 2.4 cent rate per mile, which is what the average driver that has a 20 mile per gallon vehicle would pay today in gas taxes at 49.4 cents a gallon. There's 6 unique features in our pilot that was part of our federal application to kind of tease out what we were going to add to this ongoing research and dialogue nationally. For one, it's testing border crossing. We have a unique position of bordering Canada, and so you saw Surrey, BC was listed. We actually have some residents of Surrey, BC participating in the pilot, and we're testing an international border crossing dynamic and what would happen. British Columbia is also looking at a road charge possibility, and so what would happen if BC were to do that and Washington State were to do that, and with the we have one of the busiest border crossings in the country, what would happen if we were to do that, and how would we ever reconcile it? So some of that's starting to get brought to the surface as we go through this. We also sponsored a smartphone innovation challenge with the University of Washington to develop really a beta app that would test road charging that you could use your smartphone to do it. And we are using an app right now in the pilot that actually is working quite well. And one of the interesting aspects to it is it has a toggle button that can turn the GPS on and off. So for people who don't want the GPS function of road charging, but also want to have a way to certify when they're in state or out of state, they could use this app as kind of a bridge for that, to turn it on, and you would have some kind of official way to certify you left the state for these many miles. When you come back into your state, you could turn it off. So we have people testing it as a sole source of mileage collection. It does have its pros and cons, but we hope to at least shed more light on this potential since smartphones are becoming such, are such a ubiquitous thing. We're hoping there's a way to kind of connect that with the idea of paying road charging. We're working with private business partners. Licensing subagents is what we refer to them in our state. They are agents to the Department of Licensing. They are privately held and provide licensing services. They're all over the state, and so they are there to kind of help us with those folks that don't want any technology and literally don't want to take a picture of their odometer and text it in. They want a person to do it, and they want it fully manually done. And we have a very small handful of people that have opted for that. So they're allowed to go to these offices that are working with us, and they can go there and have their mileage or odometer read manually, tech-free. We're also doing a financial interoperability test with 2 states that I'll get to in a minute, but it's really aimed at kind of how would we reconcile the tax collection between 2 states if there's not a national program? How are 2 states independently going to do that like we do today with gas tax? And then lastly, we're looking at use of consumer products for road charging, essentially using the private sector service providers to do the work for us, as opposed to being a fully state government operated program. And we are also actively working with the electric vehicle associations to make sure we're also paying special attention to the impacts it will have on electric vehicle drivers. In our state right now, we charge a $150 flat fee per year for electric vehicles in addition to the registration. Okay, so getting to a little bit on the participant recruitment, we had a pretty aggressive program that really started last summer once we were kind of in the throes of getting ready to launch the pilot. And the key was getting the word out and not having people get upset about the fact that we were talking about this and going to test it. So there was a lot of very careful messaging put together about why we were looking at it, what it really meant, you know, that it was still a ways off, that no decisions had been made. This was an opportunity for the public to really get involved upfront, informed decision-making, be a part of the decision-making. And we like that, at least I think on the West Coast, but especially in Washington State, we love to have a lot of public input on everything. So this was an opportunity for everybody to kind of get their hands on this and experience it. And frankly, the best way to talk about these kinds of things that are rather complex is to have people participate and experience it. So we have newsletters. We did a sign-up list of interested persons that was kind of organic, but we started pushing out some earned media and getting our media all over the state involved, as well as our network of contacts around the state. And as you can see, as we kind of started clicking through the summer and started doing some very targeted media engagement, we started really upticking on our signups. People were getting more and more engaged, asking more questions. We were going all over the state and making presentations to every type of service club and organization you could think of, having some pretty hard discussions around what this meant and why we were invading their privacy and were we going to track them and all those interesting topics about fairness and urban versus rural, and on it goes with those fairly common policy concerns people have. But people nonetheless really signed up, and we ended up with about over 5,000 Washingtonians saying, I'm interested and I want to participate. Social media was a big player in us boosting our numbers on the interested persons list. And we used, advertising that was location specific, multilingual, and provided ways for folks to learn through a little video kind of about what it was and how they could get engaged. Not necessarily participate, because not everybody wanted to, but there was a lot of people that want to watch and track this. So we wanted to give folks an opportunity to still stay looped in without actually signing up and doing it. We leveraged our existing networks and partners, of course, reaching out to their constituencies to broaden the net and to get outside of our transportation world, if you will, of the usual suspects. And we were quite successful in getting folks to come in from different angles. And so at the end, as I mentioned, we had over 5,000 folks interested, of which the 2,000 was drawn from, and we tried to balance it against our state's geographic and population makeup based on the census data, so that we had very good geographic representation in the state in terms of population sampling. As you can see here, percentage-wise, you can just see that we're kind of in pretty close, if not in lockstep, with our census distribution in terms of representation. By vehicle type, primarily we are dominated by gasoline vehicles, but we do have the hybrids and the electrics and plug-ins, and the others are cars that inputted VIN numbers when they signed up that didn't get picked up in the system as to what exactly it was. It might be an older vehicle, we're not sure. So we have this 8% that we can't really identify, but most likely they are gasoline vehicles. So you can see the predominant participant is driving a gas-powered vehicle. By gender, we're pretty much split evenly, 49-49. So we have a good mix, or an even split, I guess you'll say, of male and female participants across the state. Ethnicity was also an important factor for us, and we felt pretty good about these numbers, except for the Hispanic representation. During our recruitment time was also coincidentally when things were heating up in DC and the change of the administration, and so frankly I just think there were a lot of people that were not comfortable signing up for a pilot at that time and being tracked. So we understand why those numbers might be a little skewed. But for the most part, we have a fairly balanced pool in terms of race. Household income also pretty in sync, except for the really low income and the higher income. A little bit low on the higher incomes, and we'd like to have seen a little, uptick on the low income folks, but still within a range that we're going to get some good input from those folks. So getting to the pilot itself, we're testing 5 reporting methods. 2 of them do not involve any technology, the mileage permit and the odometer reading. Mileage permit is like a prepaid block of miles, like a prepaid cell phone. Very few people signed up for that. Odometer reading is a post-pay. You can take a picture and text it of your odometer, and you pay based on that. In the pilot, it's on a quarterly basis. And then we have the two plug-in options, one with GPS, one without, and then the beta smartphone mile mapper app that folks are using as well. And that was quite popular. We had to cap the participation on that one because we were a little concerned because it was a beta that it wouldn't work too well and we'd have too many participants in that option. So we wanted to make sure we controlled how many were in that. And we're actually having open enrollment this month and people are trying to switch over to that more. So that seems to be an attractive way for people to think about wanting to participate. We have two service providers, DriveSync and eMovis. eMovis has a little more limited role, but again, the idea is to test private sector service provision for this kind of program, so it's not necessarily all government run. It could be done by the private sector, and this just gives the public some experience with that interface and with the billing process as well that they receive on a monthly basis. Basically on the selection breakout, it's kind of interesting to look at it in different ways, but if you were to split it by choices of non-tech options versus the tech options, lumping smartphone and plug-in with GPS together, we're almost at 50-50 in terms of tech versus no tech. But when you look at it from how many people wanted GPS versus not, more people between the odometer read and the plug-in without GPS landed on that option versus choosing something that did have that GPS ability. It's interesting, but the smartphone, while it's technology-based, it does have the ability to turn that GPS off, so it's kind of the best of both worlds for people who kind of want that granularity when it's needed, but not all the time. Talk a little bit about the multi-jurisdictional testing. So data interoperability, as I mentioned, is being tested between all of our border states and country. We have developed a hub, which is basically a clearinghouse for the data. The idea, if you're familiar with the, and I'm blanking out on the name, but it's the organization or the committee, the national committee that deals with the freight trucks, IFTA. That's what it is. Anyway, it's modeled after IFTA, and that it's the idea would be that states that would have a road charge program would be self-governed, would be on this board, and they would kind of govern themselves in terms of whether or not a state wants to turn over all its data that's being collected over to the hub to process, a centralized processing center, or whether or not the state wants to manage its data and only turn over certain aspects or portions of that data that's absolutely necessary for processing in terms of determining miles out of state and what would be due to those states based on their mileage rate, because there would have to be a reconciliation when we're traveling, let's say across down the West Coast, and everybody has a different rate. So we're testing this notion of a hub right now on a data basis. It's computing the numbers, it's like a clearinghouse where the miles driven, the fuel consumed by all participants is being calculated from all those neighboring states. And there is a determination in a simulated manner of how much funds would be due to each state through the Treasury process. So we're also looking at the Treasury laws of each state and how that might work and make it a bit more complicated than maybe we anticipated. And then there's a real money test happening, the first in the country between us and Oregon State, where we have about 30 Washingtonians and about 70 Oregonians. They were really excited about this, and we had to actually cap that one too, because we had a lot of Oregonians who are already in the Origo program that wanted to participate in this. And these are folks that are crossing between our states a fair amount. And on the Washington side, we've given them like prepaid cards, cash cards, and they are to use that to pay their bills, but they are getting real bills and they're paying them, and then we are actually processing the money between the two states. So it's not just an Excel spreadsheet test, it's an actual cash transactional process. And so far it is going off really smoothly, so we're really excited to see the results of that. It will shed light on that national discussion of if there's not going to be a national program or policy, how will states, as they start to patchwork and do this, will they reconcile between each other in a fairly efficient way? This chart just kind of captures the flow of funds between the two states on the real money cash test. Little bit of an oversimplification. So next steps for us is we're in the middle of open enrollment right now, so we're at the 6-month point of our pilot, and we're letting every participant have the opportunity to switch options. So if people were testing a tech approach and want to try the phone app or switch to a manual one, they can do it now and then test that for 6 months and give us feedback. Our steering committee meets this month as well. They meet twice this year. We'll be doing another survey of our participants mid-pilot in September, post-open enrollment, so people that have switched can talk about why they switched and kind of this experience they had with the option they were testing. And then in February 2019, the pilot test will end, and we will use the rest of 2019 to crunch the data and analyze it. We will be doing some public outreach and media engagement on the outcome and to start the public discussion around so now what? And ultimately, the commission will issue findings, recommendations, and a transition strategy to our state legislature in the 2020 legislative session. And we will lay out a potential path forward on thinking around how we can start transitioning to a road charge system. And with that, I'm done. I don't know if you want to take questions or hold till the other presenters are done.
I think we'll hold till the other presenters, but I'm going to give us a little 5-minute bio break. So on your mark, get set, go, and we're going to come back in, let's say, 8 minutes because 5 might not cut it. So